Hello everyone, and welcome to our Bible study as we continue looking at the book of 1 Peter. Wherever you might be today, I hope you are doing well as can be at least. Again, times are difficult, we know it, they are straining on us. If you're from Manchester and you're watching this, I miss you. I look forward to the day. I can't wait until we can get back together again, that we can see each other in a different way. But for now, we will continue to make the best use of the technology that we have available and continue thinking about these things that, again, are so related in so many different ways, the book of 1 Peter, to the troubles that we go through not only now, but at any time. And Peter does a really good job of trying to get us to think through things, to change our frame of mind, if you will, and really to emulate God's thinking just a little bit more. So we're going to continue our study today. We're going to begin in chapter 3. The previous lessons have gone through the first 2 chapters. And again, you're welcome to go back and review those and see those if you haven't seen those yet, and just try to get more familiar with the book of 1 Peter. And so I do want to recap briefly kind of the flow of the book that we've seen so far. And in the first couple of chapters, what we've seen is that initially Peter provides his audience with a foundation. He really wants them to focus on salvation, and that's going to be critical for them being able to endure and even persevere through the trials that are coming their way. And he made it abundantly clear. He knew the trials that they were facing, and in part leads us to believe that those trials were due actually in part from their faith, not just regular difficulties that every Christian might face or that everybody might face, but due to that time, those circumstances, where Christianity was in its infancy in the Roman world at that time. Peter made it very clear, you will endure trials, you will go through difficult times. And again, all of that is in a direct relation to the faith that they had in God. But despite that, he urges them, pleads with them to be honorable in all of their conduct. And he provided specific examples. As we looked at last week in particular, the 2 that we looked at last week were regarding the governing authorities and really the master-slave relationship. And he illustrated that knowing the difficulties that were there, he tried to help them to have a better understanding of how, as Christians, do we respond in these situations? What does this mean to us? And again, our primary objective is to understand it from Peter's book itself, from his letter that he was writing to those Christians at that time. There are some things that I will highlight that are applicable to us today, but other things are going to be a little bit different. And so we want to be careful whenever we start applying, and first and foremost in this class, our goal is understanding and trying to put ourselves in that frame of mind of his initial audience and understand his writing for them. So after looking at the emperor and the governing authorities and the master-slave relationship, he's going to move on to really the household. We're going to look at husbands and wives briefly, and then he's going to tie all of this together with some general principles that would really apply not only in those situations, all 4 of those situations that he discussed, but in our relationships in particular with other Christians as it helps us in our difficult times, but also just good principles and reminders that Christians need to apply in every relationship. And so we're going to tie all of that together at the end as we look at this text today. So initially I want to go ahead and I want to read the first 7 verses of chapter 3. And if you have a Bible, I hope you pick it up. I hope you go ahead and read it. I hope you see Peter's writings for yourself, and I hope you continually search through this letter to try to have a better picture of how everything fits together. And so again, we're going to read the first 7 verses. We're going to look at wives and husbands and reflect on those that the Christians in that state at that time in Peter's writing. In verse 1, it says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So again, we have to realize that we're dealing with a very specific situation in this text, and our primary interest is in understanding it in Peter's context. So in this case, he was writing specifically to wives who are living with unbelieving husbands. So Christian wives living with unbelieving husbands in the context of the Roman world where they lived, and those really norms in society. Much of that is different today. Some of these principles would apply differently today if we looked at how they functioned in our society. We'll address a couple of those things, but certainly not to the depth that we could look at those ideas. So the implication is, again, how does a Christian wife, how is she supposed to live with an unbelieving husband? Well, that's a delicate situation in that culture at that time. Culturally, there was really kind of an expectation that the wife would follow, for the most part, that the wife would follow the religion of the husband. And so you can imagine the difficulty that would put some wives, the position that would put them in, where, again, how do I respond to this? How do I act in this? Because if they, as Christians, recognize Christ as Lord and have given their lives to him, they know they can't submit, and they have to be careful how they begin to appear to worship other gods in different settings like that. But at the same time, society would expect them to maybe act otherwise. Society would possibly expect them to follow their husbands regardless of their thoughts. And so it was a difficult scenario, it was a difficult situation that many of them would have found themselves if they were in this particular situation. So in our text, Peter's going to build off the ideas, some of the ideas that he's already expressed, where he says likewise. So he just got done talking about the master-slave relationship. Now, that doesn't seem very flattering at first, and certainly there's not a direct comparison between those two. But some of the principles that he's just established, some of the ideas that he's just looked at, are also going to form the foundation for what he's looking at here. One of them in particular is the idea of submission that he's tying to. And he goes back, he just got done elaborating on the submission that Jesus personally did with regard to his sacrifice and his reasoning for it. And so again, in all of these examples that Peter is looking at, there's an idea that continually comes back and ties to Jesus. And Jesus is the foundation, the reason for all of it. So he's building off of some of the ideas that he's already established. And really the reasoning behind this idea in this case is stated quite clear. So that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word. Now what's interesting is even in that culture and that time, the very idea, from what I can tell historically, of at times, again, in some cultures, these were not the same everywhere across the Roman world. So I'm trying not to overgeneralize, but look at the reality too of even the differences sometimes of a wife teaching a husband in certain scenarios. And so I think it's interesting that Peter points out that without a word, in other words, what might be the most powerful way that you can teach your husband, which is what you want to do in that culture at that time? Well, Peter says it's through your actions. Some may not even have the opportunity or very limited opportunity to use words to teach Christianity like we might want to. Now, obviously, in the Bible, we see examples of instances that are contrary to this. So this was not everywhere or anything like that. And even the idea of addressing the situation in between the Jewish the Jewish population, the background that they had, versus more the different cultures, the Roman cultures that existed in Asia and different parts at this time, even that would have been different. So I'm speaking very generally, and certainly not all of these things would apply across the board in that situation. But Peter has an interest. Hopefully it would be the same interest as the Christian wife, to win her husband to Christ. And so that's kind of forming the foundation of what Peter hopes that these individuals can come to know Christ. Well, given that scenario, he talks about a few general principles that are going to have to be followed. One, he says, be subject or submissive to your husbands. Now again, not all of the things that he had talked about in regard to what came before this are going to apply exactly the same way, given this relationship then, given an application today. Some of these things are going to look very different today because of the society's expectation. This idea is one that is obviously discussed a lot. It's very controversial even at times, and many Christians are still wondering, how does this apply? How does this work today? How does this principle apply today? Well, again, this is one of those instances that I think we can look at this idea and learn a lesson about how society does impact how to apply different admonitions and teachings from God. For instance, the very idea of submissiveness, what that would look like in that culture and what the expectation in that culture would be, in some instances is going to be completely different and even backwards from how society would look at it today. Different actions that could take place in that society that would be respected and that would give a good name to Christianity at that time, the same actions today might actually create a bad name, a disrespectful name, and actually tarnish the idea of Christianity a little bit. And so again, there's a lot of differences between what Peter is dealing with then and how we are looking at this right now. I will elaborate on this a little bit more later, but the general principle that Peter is admonishing and teaching Christian wives at that time, in that culture, with an unbelieving spouse, one principle is be subject or submissive to your husband. Another one that he talks about is do not focus on the external adorning. He says, again in verse 3, and he gives example, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry. And sometimes that sounds very interesting to us because none of that really means anything in our society. And again, that's another example of how these principles that Peter is establishing will be practiced differently in different societies based on the expectations that are there. Now, I do think there's a reason in this context that Peter would be talking about this, and again, we'll look at that in just a little bit as well, but this is another idea. Do not focus on the external adorning. Instead, he wants them to focus on their character, the inner spirit that is there. And that's really the third idea. Think about your actions. Who are you portraying? And that's what he wants them to realize. Don't focus on the external. Don't focus on all of this. Instead, who are you? Are you portraying Christ in all of your actions. He says, conduct yourself with the beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Now again, Peter's going to go a little bit further with this. He's going to illustrate that this is nothing new. And he gives the example that godly women of the past have done the same thing. Now what's interesting here is that he actually uses the example of Sarah, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. What's fascinating with that example, and this kind of ties to some of the things that we've looked at, is that when you look back at the life of Abraham and Sarah, you're going to find instances where Abraham actually submits to Sarah. And I think that's the idea. Yes, there were times in the scriptures where Sarah submitted to Abraham and it was the right thing to do. And there were other times where Abraham submitted to Sarah and it also appeared to be the right thing to do. When you look at how Paul described the functioning of the husband and wife together, we see it's not a one-side dominating thing. Now again, we're tying this to society expectations. So when you look at this in the grand picture of Peter, I just want to ask this question. What would be the result? What could happen if Christian wives decide to disregard the norms of society at that time in the name of Christianity? We thought about it last week with regard to the governing authorities. That would put them in a very difficult position with Rome itself as a religion that's already being watched closely and could make them really public enemy number one to the Roman authorities, and that's going to lead to very difficult times. Well, then we looked at the idea of masters and slaves and realized again that if Christians rose up and said, we don't have to follow this, the significance of that in that society at that time could again draw to them persecution and a life that they do not want, that would make things much more difficult in the grand scheme of things. So God seems to be guiding them away from these difficulties that could come their way if they chose to face these difficulties in that fashion. And so again, here's another one. If Christian wives decided to rise up and say to their husbands, I don't have to follow you, I don't have to do this, I don't have to do that, what's the impression that's going to be made? How is that going to affect the unbelieving husband at that time? Well, first and foremost, it's probably going to come across as a complete sign of disrespect. On a personal note, do you see people being won over by arguments or discussions by being disrespected? I don't. Remember what Peter's goal is: to win the husband. Hopefully that's the goal of the Christian wife as well in this instance, to win the husband. Well, I think what Peter's saying is you're not going to do that by going against all the expectations of society at that time and creating a situation where everybody, including the husband, is looking at it as a complete sign of disrespect. And what kind of trouble could that bring to the wife as well in the home? Instead, Peter's giving them a different way, a way that is Christ-like. In some situations, it wasn't even going to be right, but he still anchors it in the very actions of Christ, who submitted himself for the better, for what God desired. Now, let's tie in the husband's part, and we'll kind of tie these together just a little bit. Now, the fact that verse 7 is only one verse, I often joke about that. The fact that it's shorter doesn't mean that husbands need less teaching. In fact, the opposite can be seen in Ephesians chapter 5 when it comes to husbands and wife with Paul's admonition. But again, he's going to draw some conclusions. What he's getting at and the overall flow of what he's looking at, the situation would be much more difficult for a wife in that position than for a husband. So there isn't as much reading in this instance. And so Again, he says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in the understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So, the lessons here, first of all, live with your wife with understanding. If there's ever a better practical lesson for us husbands, I'm not sure what it is. This is an area we can all admit we can grow in. At that time in Peter's culture and Peter's society and ours as well. But he adds to that. He says, show honor to your wife as the weaker vessel. Now, it's often discussed, what does this mean? What implication is weaker here? And I think there's two ways that kind of stick out that we could it wouldn't be too much of a stretch of us trying to identify different areas in that society. First of all, there's what most people believe this is looking at, and just at the physical side. We don't have to stretch our imaginations that overall, when you look at society, when you look at the design of men and women, we're made differently. And overall, men tend to be stronger physically, and therefore have been able to exert that force and that power in ways that are very contrary to God at times. And so I think Peter's reminding all men, Christian men, work with your wife. Be with your wife. Show honor to her as the weaker, not only physically, but at that time, you also need to realize that the social power that she had would have probably, in most situations, have been less. And so here you are as a husband. You have not only physical power, but social power. You have all of these things. How should you respond? Well, it's very clear. You respond by treating her in honor. Again, very Christ-like, very God-like. Now, I think it's worth mentioning to anyone who would abuse what Peter's saying right here. God never overlooks those who abuse their power. And I think he's reminding Christian husbands at that time to use that power in a way that's godlike, where we serve, where we honor others in a very different way than some could use that power. He adds that a beautiful picture. You are heirs together. He puts them in the same place. He draws them together, and it's a beautiful picture that husbands and wives can take with them, can remember in a situation where they both have Christ. We are heirs together with Christ. And then he adds this interesting idea so that your prayers may not be hindered. The best that I can tell, if I try to put this in the flow of Peter's argument, is this. Is God going to listen to the prayers of an abusive husband? And I'm using the term abusive in a very general way, not just physical, but lording it over. What's he trying to say? Give honor. And with that, I want to give another reminder on a final note on this idea of submission, because I think we tie all of this together with this idea. And I think it's a very important one to remember. And all of the times that I've kind of worked with couples who are going to be married, and we've looked at these ideas and the principles found in the Bible, and in almost every instance, this idea comes up. What does that mean? And there's almost a look of surprise to a wife because it's so a wife to be that it's so foreign to our concept or in our culture. Do I have to submit? What does that look like? One note. First off, again, this is Peter speaking directly to a wife in that culture with an unbelieving husband. In that instance, what does Peter say? Submit. But you notice what he didn't say to the husband. What the Bible never once implies. In fact, it says the opposite. Even though the admonition to the wife to submit is given in that culture and time and society for very good reasons, never once does the Bible indicate or admonish the husband to use the idea of submission and mandate the idea of submission. Those are two very different things. He doesn't give the husband the right to do that. He admonishes the wife when it's right to do that. And in Ephesians 5, we see a beautiful picture of them mutually submitting to one another in a sacrificial, forgiving, loving kind of way, just like Christ loved the church. And so again, looking at it in Peter's time and looking at it in our time, they don't always go hand in hand. And I'm not even going to begin to tie in all of the applications to today as far as how this looks and what this might look like. But we have general principles to begin to understand how it looks to society, how these principles are followed, and how we live today. But he goes on and he's going to tie kind of all of this together, what we looked at last week and what we looked at this week. And in verse 8, I want to go ahead and read something very important because these principles are going to be applicable in all of these relationships. He says, "Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil, and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Finally, and again, he brings all of this together with some more general principles. But he describes his desire ultimately is for Christians to be united in brotherly love. And I do think he's coming back to the idea of Christians at this point. And given all of the terrible scenarios that he just described, okay, how Christians are going to struggle with the governing authorities, how they're going to struggle with the master-slave relationship, how some households, how some wives are going to struggle in certain situations. Given all of the terrible things that can happen and in some cases will happen, isn't it understandable that God would provide for them a better place? That God would provide for them a church family that is there to help in their time of need? I think it's a beautiful reminder in a practical way of how important our church family can be when things are going significantly bad. So God wants to pull Christians together at this point because some of them are going to need help from one another. Here's where it gets really fascinating, really countercultural. Even if evil came their way, do not respond with evil, but rather blessing. Very countercultural at that time, but critically important to what Peter's trying to address. We need to realize, too, this isn't something that can be done in a trivial way. This isn't something where we can kind of begrudgingly, pronounce a blessing on someone, pray for someone, actually want the best when inside we just want evil. We can't do that. We can't. So what's Peter drawing? What's he illustrating? A complete change of character. He says, I want you to be something completely different than the world. I want you to be like Christ. The world says, revenge your name. When people do evil to you, pay them back. Jesus said, I'll submit, because that's what God needed him to do at that time. Peter's trying to show them to present Christianity in a different way. In a practical way, again, I think he's drawing out the idea that if they fail to do this, things could actually get a whole lot worse for them anyways. But at the same time, this is how Christianity was going to spread. This is how God wanted Christianity to spread, with a Christ-like spirit. And then he draws from Psalm 34, which is interesting because when you look at the psalm, it is thought to represent a time that God delivered David from a difficult scenario. I think he's reminding his audience, God hasn't forgotten you. Yes, things are difficult, but God's still there. Now, what's interesting also is that while we see this quotation that's coming from Psalm 34 in this instance, if you go ahead and read the psalm, you're going to see the ideas from the psalm scattered all throughout Peter's letter. I encourage you to do so. In fact, if I can leave you with one piece of homework as you continue to read and familiarize yourself with 1 Peter, read Psalm 34 as well. Read that text and see how many ideas you don't spot as well in Peter's writing. So again, what possibly he thinks they should have understood from Psalm 34 is that in the midst of trials, God is still there. They're going through trials. He's reminding them over and over, God is still there. So what are our takeaways this week? Well, the first is this. God has very high, godly standards for husbands and wives. How we act towards one another, he has very high standards. And it would be very wise for us, if we want our marriages to be all that God intended, to follow those admonitions and those lessons. God's standard for Christians, number 2, is Christ-likeness in everything. All of this draws back to the example of Christ, how he gave himself, how he submitted to an unjust, unfair, horrific scenario because it's what God needed him to do at that time, because it was what God needed for his plan. What is Peter telling his audience? Yes, it's unfair. Yes, it's unjust. Yes, some of you are being put in awful positions, but what is needed? To be like Christ. To change your entire character and spirit. And finally, number 3, in Peter's words, the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. That hasn't changed. And even Peter's audience, who would call themselves Christians, needed to understand this. That even in that state, should we decide to disregard this, should we decide to move ourselves into the category that God would call evil, we will move God's face toward and against us. That hasn't changed. Our status and position will not get rid of that. God's face will be against those who do evil. And he has not forgotten and he has not abandoned those who do good. As Christians today, things are difficult. Things are odd. And for some, things are unbelievably challenging and frightening right now. But God hasn't abandoned us. He hasn't left. He hasn't turned his back. He's with his children. He's still teaching us, still showing us how to live in a world that still presents difficulties. Let's take these admonitions from Peter. Let's take these reminders from Peter and try to understand to the best of our ability how they apply in our society today. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I encourage you to continue to look through this message for hope, for encouragement for yourself. And again, this is a reminder, you don't have to go through anything that you might be going through by yourself. If myself or others can help you in any way, please reach out and let us know. God bless.